Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the burial of Jesus, John chapter 19, verses 38 through 42. But before we go there, I want to go back by way of review and talk a bit about the crucifixion, what we saw, and maybe point out something else that we didn't notice last time. In the crucifixion event, we had, first of all, the place was mentioned, the place of the skull, Golgotha. We had those who were crucified, both Jesus and there were two other men, one on either side. We had the inscription that said, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Remember how the Jewish leaders had gone to Pilate and said, can you change that? And he refused to budge. So the inscription remained, and everybody who came by, and a lot of people came by, they saw the inscription. Next, we had the casting of lots for the garments. We had the charge to Mary and that disciple whom Jesus loved, that other disciple, the unnamed one. And we saw the sponge and the significance of that so close to the city. We saw his death, and finally the broken legs. And one of the Roman soldiers took a spear and shoved it into his side, I think with the intent of making sure he was dead. Pierced his heart, and out comes water mixed with blood, or at least that's what it looks like. And there's significance to all those things. But um, have you ever been watching maybe an action movie, or maybe it was a mystery of some sort, and two characters come into a room, and you can hear the music. It's something's about to happen, and the camera focuses instead of the characters. It focuses on the kitchen table where there's a knife sitting on the table, and you just know because of the music and the situation that somehow that knife is going to be significant to the story. Well, as we look at the crucifixion event, everything that we just mentioned is significant because each one has been prepped for us earlier in the story, where the camera of the gospel account has focused on different aspects that all came together in this crucifixion event. For example, we have that he handed them over. Pilate handed Jesus over for them to be crucified. And we'd already read back in John chapter 14 and 3 and verse 14, where the author John had said, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that he was going to be lifted up in his death. We already saw that. That had been told to us. We read where it was written, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. And that idea of kingship had been seen as early as John chapter 1, verse 49, where Nathanael had said, Rabbi, you're the Son of God, you're the King of Israel. And then later on, there were those who tried to take Jesus by force and make him to be their king. So that theme has already been before us. The soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his outer garments and made four parts. And the taking of a garment, we had actually seen that in John chapter 13, verses 3 and 4, where Jesus, knowing all the things that were about to take place, and notice that he had come forth from God and that was going back to God, got up from the table and laid aside his garments. So here the Roman soldiers are taking them, but he had already voluntarily laid them aside to wash the feet of his disciples. Now they are being taken from him. Again, this is voluntarily on his part. They're doing it. They're not asking permission, but he does it as he washes us, as he washes all the world with his death. We continue with the charge to Mary. Now, she's not mentioned by name anywhere in the Gospel of John. Woman, behold your son. And then he said to the other disciple, behold your mother. And we noticed how that formality had already been seen back in John chapter 2 and verse 4, where Jesus had said to her, woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come. And yet here as he's on the cross, his hour has come. And the hour is at hand, and it's all taking place just the way it was supposed to. We had, after this, Jesus said, I am thirsty. And Jesus has already spoken earlier in the Gospel of John about thirst. Remember in his conversation with the Samaritan woman, where he says, whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. He was thirsty so that we need never be thirsty. This is all played out in this story. We have a jar full of sour wine that was standing there. And we already read about some stone jars, six stone water pots that were set there for the Jewish custom of purification. He was on the cross for 6 hours. Here were these stone water pots that were there, six of them. Um, He was on the cross for 6 hours so that he could purify us. Likewise, they put a sponge full of sour wine upon a branch of hyssop and brought it up to his mouth. And we read the echo of that, the precursor of that, where he spoke um, to the servants at the wedding feast. Draw out some now and take it to the head waiter. And they brought it to him so that he would taste it. And you remember how Jesus had received the sour wine. He said, "It's finished." The head waiter had tasted the water that had become wine. And you read a little further, and it says, "You've kept the good wine, the better wine, until now." Jesus is the better wine. That remember, he's the one who poured out his own blood for us, so that we need never thirst. You have where he gave up his spirit, and Jesus had talked about how he lays down his life for the sheep. Nobody takes it from him. He lays it down voluntarily. We have John chapter 19, verse 34, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And we've seen both of those. We saw the blood part when in John chapter 6, verse 55, where Jesus had said, "My flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink," the significance of his blood, but also the aspect of water, where in John chapter 7, verses 37 and 38, Jesus had stood up on that last day of the feast and said, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink, and he who believes in me, as the scripture said, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water." And so with that, we're ready now. We've seen all of these elements, and we're not quite done yet. We're going to see maybe one or two more. As we come to John chapter 19, verse 38, Jesus has died, and now after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but a secret one. Now, this Joseph of Arimathea, notice that term Arimathea, um, it's mentioned, both Joseph and where he is from is mentioned in all four gospel accounts. That's significant because all four gospel accounts don't always tell the same story, but they do here. And Eusebius, an early church historian, about the 3rd or 4th century AD, identifies this place, Arimathea, with Ramathaim Zophim, the birthplace of Samuel. And he notes that it was also known, and you can find this in the Old Testament, known as Ramah. Notice Arimathea, Ramah. You can almost hear it in the term. We are told in one of the other gospel accounts that this was a place in the land of Israel. This was a place nearby, just a bit to the north of Jerusalem. And so here's this Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus. That is, he had become a Jesus follower, but he kept it secret, a secret one for fear of the Jews, because the Jews had been out to not only put Jesus to death, but had been out to persecute and maybe even to put to death any of the Jesus followers. And so here's this leader, and he's described in the other gospel accounts, a leader among the Jews, but he's been keeping it secret. And so he asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate granted permission, so he came and took away his body, that is the body of Jesus, to care for it and to give it an appropriate burial. Now, we also read verse 39, Nicodemus, and we've already read about Nicodemus. Again, the setup for this has already taken place back in John chapter 3, that we had that whole section, that interview with Nicodemus, who had come, in fact, we're told here, who had first come to him by night, just in case you forgot. Had that been also in secret? Was Nicodemus a secret disciple? He had actually spoken out in favor of Jesus, and they had questioned him. Are you one of his followers? And we didn't read his answer. Did he deny Jesus? Did he just stay silent? Or had he spoken favorably? We're not told. But notice now he comes bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight. Now, when it speaks about 100 pounds worth, the Greek term hos is like about, approximately. Notice the term litras hecaton. The hecaton is the 100, but a litros, now that sounds like a liter, but it's not. It actually comes from the Latin libra, which isn't quite 100 pounds. It's close. It's up there. And actually, that term Libra, you know how sometimes we will abbreviate the word pounds, and we'll put the letters LB, and you say, what? That why not PD for pounds or something like that? The LB is actually from the Latin Libra, um, and it's close to a pound, but not quite. It's about 3/4 of a pound. So instead of 100 pounds, maybe about 75 pounds. But you want to hear the word 100 because that's there. So it's rounded off around there. And so he's going to bring this myrrh and aloes. These are sweet smelling things that will be placed on the body because let me just say, a body as it decomposes, it doesn't smell good. It smells awful. And so this will maybe mitigate some of that odor that might be there otherwise. And he's going to prepare the body. Now, we're told that same weight, a litros, Mary, remember, had brought a litros in John chapter 12 and verse 3, not of these myrrh and aloes, but of this ointment to anoint the feet of Jesus. Well, here it's being to prepare the body. Again, 100-fold of what Mary had brought. So she brought a little amount. This is quite a bit more, and it's being used for this preparation. Verse 40, so they came and took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen wrappings with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. It was and still is to this day a Jewish practice to bury the body. Now, back then, maybe everybody did it. I'm not quite sure of that. But today, it's the burial custom of my Jewish friends to bury the body within 24 hours because they don't like to put extra, you can put chemicals and things that sort of do things to the body. And our Jewish friends actually refrain from doing that. And so for that reason, they try to get the burial fairly quickly. And this is all taking place here. This was the custom of the Jews. So notice you've got the spices, the wrappings, all of these things taking place. Now, in the place where he was crucified, now notice this isn't somewhere across town. In the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, and it's striking that Jesus had been in a garden earlier where he had prayed that prayer in John chapter 18, chapter 17, I'm sorry. There'd been a garden there, but this is a different garden. We said back then a garden always has a wall around it, so evidently there was a garden with a wall around it. And in the garden, a new tomb in which no one had been laid. And we're going to find out. Now, John doesn't tell us this, but we're going to find out in the other accounts that this tomb belongs to Joseph of Arimathea. Here it just says there happens to be a new tomb here. Therefore, because of the Jewish day of preparation, and we'd already read about that preparation, that this was the day of preparation for the Passover, but it's also getting close to the preparation for the Sabbath. These are both things that are happening together here. And since the tomb was nearby, notice it seems to be something of convenience that they laid Jesus there. And that brings up the question, this appears to be a convenient expedient. The tomb is handy and the time constraints are upon them. And so they place the body in the tomb for this reason. But that also brings up the question, was this meant to be temporary? Now, let me say, it's going to end up being temporary. Not in the way they had planned. Maybe they had planned to put the body here just because, they don't have time to put it elsewhere. And maybe they're thinking of eventually moving it or maybe long-term moving it. But, but it's going to be more temporary than they realize because the resurrection is about to take place just within a few days. They don't know that, but you and I know that because we know the rest of the story. And I like to think about how Joseph of Arimathea, now we're not told here that it's his tomb, but we're told other places, and we'll see that in a minute. Um, Joseph of Arimathea got his tomb back. So that if you could ever find the tomb in which Jesus had been placed, there would be a body there, not the body of Jesus, but the body of Joseph of Arimathea and maybe his entire family. We're going to look at that right now. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell the same story. We already mentioned Joseph of Arimathea, and notice you have that in each of these accounts. Matthew starts off, Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away. Mark's account says Joseph of Arimathea became a prominent member of the council. We hadn't seen that before, but notice he's actually a member of the Sanhedrin, who himself was waiting for the kingdom of God. You get to verse 46. Joseph brought a linen cloth and took him down and wrapped him in the linen cloth and laid him in a tomb which had been hewn out in the rocks. Essentially, it says the same thing, although it doesn't mention it's his own tomb. That was seen in Matthew. Rolled a stone, and notice both Matthew and Mark talk about how a stone was rolled. Remember that, because we're going to come back to that. Luke's account, a man named Joseph, who was a member of the council, we get to verse 51, from Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who was waiting for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, and he took it down and wrapped it in a linen cloth and laid him in a tomb cut into the rock. Now, it doesn't say anything about the stone, at least not here. I think it does say it later on, where no one had ever lain. We find out it's Matthew. It's Joseph's tomb. It had been cut out of the rock, but notice also the stone had been rolled over it. And so, but it was also a tomb where nobody had ever been laid. That was already seen in John and mentioned here as well. By the way, what that does do, that tells us that the very nice-looking tomb that's commonly called the garden tomb, it's way north of where the temple was, sort of out of the way. That wasn't the tomb of Jesus, because that wasn't a new tomb in the first century. We archaeologists have looked at that, and they've concluded, no, that was in use quite a bit before even the birth of Jesus. Now, here's a picture of a tomb, and notice in this case there's a stone, but this isn't a rolling stone, this is a plug. Let me show you a different picture like that. This sort of tomb was very commonplace, where you would have the tomb and then a plug that you would have to shove into place, and it would maybe keep the odor that was on the inside from getting out. The tomb of Jesus wasn't like this. We're told very specifically that a stone was rolled into place and then rolled away. And the language is specific to that. And so even though these tombs like this were not quite so commonplace, especially in the first century, yet that's the kind of tomb that this was. So the stone was rolled into place. Now here's a cutaway. Now this isn't my drawing. This is made by Hugh Claycomb. Nice drawing. So I'm just sharing it, and I borrowed this from one of the books on Four Portraits, One Jesus. They do a great job with this. Shows what a larger tomb would typically look like. Notice you've got the rolling stone, and then a place to lay the body. But then notice those other slots. What would happen? They'd lay the body there. It would be wrapped, and they would allow the body to decompose, maybe for a year or even longer. And then they would come back at a later date and take the bones, because the rest of the body had decomposed. They would put it into what's called an ossuary. That is a line, usually made of limestone, where you can carve it out. And it's a stone box. Think of what's the term for it? Think of a sarcophagus, but not full size. This would be much smaller, because the body is already decomposed, and so it has to be large enough to hold the largest bone, which is your thigh bone, which means about 2.5, 3 feet is going to be big enough to do it. and they would collect the bones and put it in an ossuary, and then put that ossuary into one of these niches. See how those are located there. Now, here's a tomb which is actually on the Mount of Olives, and it has a number of ossuaries that are here. You can see what looks like, I think it is, maybe a flat surface behind there. You can see a place where the body might have been laid. Now, this isn't the tomb of Jesus. This is just an example of another wealthy tomb. And you can tell it's wealthy. Look at the one ossuary that's very ornate. They're not all like that. Some are ornate, some are very plain. But what has happened there, the body has been placed there, and then at a later date, they would come and collect the bones and place them into an ossuary. Was it their intent to leave Jesus in this tomb for that length of period? Was it going to be just a short-term thing, and then they would place him in a more permanent tomb, again, to eventually place that in an ossuary? We're not told. But in any case, Joseph of Arimathea is going to get his tomb back, because Jesus is going to, and we'll see this in the next chapter, Jesus is going to rise from the dead.